We're going to start off on this topic by looking at and trying to understand the nature of the entrepreneurial mindset. So it's really important when we study a topic like entrepreneurship that we have a good handle on what an entrepreneur is, and we try and understand what are the specific characteristics or traits that would define someone as a successful entrepreneur. And what I'm going to talk about in this topic are some of the key elements that would be used to describe an entrepreneur, or a successful entrepreneur that is, and talk about whether we might be able to create these attributes or these characteristics in individuals. So is this something that's unique to particular people and only those types of people can be entrepreneurs? Or are these sets of skills or abilities that can actually be developed or grown within anyone who's looking to engage in entrepreneurship? So throughout the study of entrepreneurship, there's been a couple of really central questions, questions that a lot of researchers have come back to time and time again. And the reason they're interested in these is because the act of entrepreneurship is such a human-based individual activity. And so the questions that have really driven entrepreneurship research are the question of what are the traits or characteristics of successful entrepreneurs? Of all the people we see out there engaged in entrepreneurial activity, there's certain individual traits or personality traits, individual characteristics that mean that some people are more likely to be successful as entrepreneurs. And if we try and understand these characteristics, if we try and map out what these characteristics might be, we might be better at predicting when certain people will be more successful at entrepreneurial activities. And certainly later on in this topic, what I'm going to do is talk to you about what some of those characteristics of a successful entrepreneur might be. And sitting behind this question is an even deeper and more fundamental question that's been, again, at the centre of a lot of entrepreneurship research. And this is really the question of whether entrepreneurs are born or whether we can actually make entrepreneurs. So some people would say that entrepreneurial activity is driven by and informed by a set of unique characteristics that only certain types of people possess. And what we need to do when we're trying to grow entrepreneurship within a country or a region is identify those people with those characteristics and support them to be successful. Others would say that entrepreneurs can actually be made or created, that the skills that it requires to be an entrepreneur are skills that can be actually learnt, that people can complete courses and undertake study and build these abilities through practice and research. And by doing so, they're actually able to turn themselves into successful entrepreneurs. And really this is like the classic argument that we see in so many areas of human life. How much of our existence is driven by our nature, by our biology, and how much of it is driven by the way we are nurtured or the way we're schooled and educated and brought up. For me, I tend to think that it's a little bit of both. I think there are certainly some inherent personality characteristics and some individual traits that some people seem to possess that other people don't possess. And I think those things are unique to them from birth, and it becomes very difficult to actually try and acquire those things. But I also do think that there are some characteristics and traits of entrepreneurs that can be learned, that there are things that we can actually develop and refine and grow within ourselves as individuals, and that by doing so we might greatly improve the success that we have in entrepreneurial activities. So when you're looking at the Milo site for this topic and you're looking at the reading area, you'll see that I've put up there for you a debate that comes from the Entrepreneur magazine. And in this debate, they look at both sides around this, about whether entrepreneurs can actually be created or whether some people are just born entrepreneurs. And really when we think about entrepreneurship, what we're trying to understand when we look at the individual entrepreneur is what are their motivations? What drive these people to engage in entrepreneurial activity? What are the characteristics? What are the facets of their behaviours, their past experiences that might influence them to engage in entrepreneurship? And as I said earlier, by doing so, what we're able to do then is make better predictions about who may or may not be engaged in entrepreneurial activity. Now, when we look at entrepreneurial motivations, there are sort of seen as being two broad drivers or motivations that will lead people to engage in entrepreneurial activities. The first are opportunity-driven entrepreneurs. So opportunity-driven entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs who are driven by the perception of external opportunities, things that are available to them in the marketplace. People are aware of these things, and through their own choice, because they've got options and they have the ability to choose to do things, they choose to pursue these opportunities. What we tend to see is that opportunity-driven entrepreneurship tends to be most common in developed economies. Once people's basic conditions of living are taken care of, there's much greater scope for them to engage in opportunity-driven entrepreneurship. The second type of motivation that we might see is necessity-driven entrepreneurs. So necessity-driven entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs who engage in entrepreneurial behaviour not necessarily because they want to, but because of necessity, because the conditions in their environment mean that they have to pursue entrepreneurial activities as a way of improving their living conditions. So for example, if you're living in a developing country and the traditional industry that you operated in, so say subsistence farming, is no longer viable, then that might drive you into engaging into small-scale entrepreneurial activities as a way of diversifying away from that dependence on an agricultural-based economy. Similarly, if your country has been destroyed by war or acts of natural forces, that may be necessary for you to actually engage in entrepreneurial activity as a way of regrowing and redeveloping your home and your place. So again, when we're looking at entrepreneurs, we need to understand what are the underlying motivations. Are people motivated to engage in entrepreneurship because they've seen an opportunity and they have the conditions and the resources available to them to pursue those? Or is it that they're pursuing entrepreneurship because of necessity, because there's no other options that are available to them, and so therefore they have to pursue entrepreneurship as a way of gaining success? Again, necessity-driven entrepreneurship is quite common amongst groups in society who are marginalised, or immigrant communities, for example, tend to be quite common in adopting necessity-driven entrepreneurship. Because they tend to be excluded sometimes from the mainstream of economic activity, they find it necessary to engage in entrepreneurship as a way of actually creating industries for themselves to engage in. So again, when we're thinking about the nature of an entrepreneur and we're thinking about the things that would define an entrepreneur, we really want to think about these underlying entrepreneurial motivations. And what we also need to be mindful of when we start thinking about the notion of an entrepreneur is that there are actually quite significant differences in entrepreneurial behaviours and practices around the globe. Entrepreneurship does occur in most countries. So wherever you look, whether it's India, Vietnam, Australia, United States, Sweden, Denmark, whichever country you might choose, you are going to find some level of entrepreneurial activity. But what we notice when we look at that as countries is that the nature and the type of entrepreneurial activities will vary quite significantly. Now, these differences in entrepreneurial activity between countries are actually captured quite nicely through what's called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And I've put onto the Milo site for you a link to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. It's a really good website because it allows you to look at entrepreneurial activity in different countries and get a sense of the differences and similarities that we might see in entrepreneurial behaviour between different places around the world. So the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, or GEM, is a global cooperative designed to measure the characteristics and volume of entrepreneurial activity. So their purpose is to develop reports on different countries so that we do have an accurate indication of the types of entrepreneurship that are occurring. And when we look at the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, what we see is that there are quite significant differences in characteristics of entrepreneurs globally. So for example, and they talk about this a little bit in the textbook, when we look at age, countries like Japan tend to be home to much older entrepreneurs. People tend to engage in entrepreneurial activities once they get later in life, so over 40. When you look at some of the countries in Africa, however, entrepreneurship tends to happen in much younger demographics. So people who are just starting out in their employment careers tend to engage in entrepreneurial activity. When we also look at entrepreneurial activity globally, we can also see that there's quite significant differences in gender levels within entrepreneurial activity. So again, for example, entrepreneurship in Japan tends to be very much driven by men. There don't tend to be as many Japanese women engaging in entrepreneurial activities. But when we look at countries, look at areas like Africa, for example, what we see is that the numbers of female citizens engaged in entrepreneurship are much higher. So again, it's really important when we're thinking about the entrepreneur and we're thinking about the nature of entrepreneurial behaviour in countries, that we understand that each country or each area is going to be quite different. And the different context in which these people operate will greatly shape the type and nature of entrepreneurial behaviours that they exhibit. So when we look across countries, when we look at different contexts, what we see is that there are quite significant differences in things like laws. So for example, Australia has very different laws around bankruptcy than, say, the United States. We also know that there can be quite significant differences in culture. So the culture in India is quite different from the culture in China. And so because of those cultural differences, because of the way that people interact with each other, that will shape the nature of entrepreneurial behaviour within those countries. We also know that there are quite significant differences in values and norms between countries. So the things that are important in a country like Australia are quite different from what might be important in a country like Vietnam. And so again, when you're understanding and reviewing the types of entrepreneurial activity that we might see within a country, we need to be mindful of these differences in values and norms. We also know that there are quite significant differences in terms of industry and infrastructure between countries. So, the industrial mix in Australia is quite heavily geared now towards service industries. I think the service industries account for about 50 to 60% of our domestic economy. That tends to be quite different from, say, a country like Thailand, where manufacturing and agriculture tend to be much stronger in the economy and tend to be areas where there are far greater opportunities for entrepreneurial activity. So again, understanding the industry landscape and understanding what types of industries are popular will tell us a little bit about where we might see entrepreneurial activity happening. And we also need to be thinking about the infrastructure. And when I talk about infrastructure, I'm not just talking about the physical or built infrastructure. I'm talking about the infrastructure of processes and laws and activities that sit around entrepreneurship that may differ from one country to the next. So again, when we think about entrepreneurship and when we think about entrepreneurial differences, we need to think about these differences between countries and context and how that context might shape the nature of what counts as being a successful entrepreneur. Now, to understand these concepts in a little bit more detail, I'd highly recommend that you look at pages 41 through to 43 of the prescribed textbook. In that section, they talk about these concepts in a little bit more detail and give you a bit of an overview about what these these situations might mean. I've also put under Milo for you a link to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor so that you can have a look at this for yourself and see the types of information that are available.